I am a social psychologist and research fellow at the Kinsey Institute, and I study the science of sex and relationships. I study a lot of different things, among them sexual fantasies. So I actually wrote a book called Tell Me What You Want that's based on the largest study of sexual fantasies ever conducted in the United States. And it looks at what we fantasize about, why we fantasize about the things that we do, and also how to get more of what we want in our sex lives. But I've also done research on friends with benefits, including what happens to those relationships in the long term, how to most effectively maintain them, whether you can actually go back to being just friends. And I've studied a lot of other things. So it's a fun job, and there's never a dull moment in the life of a sex researcher.
I bet there's not.
My parents didn't let me go to school for psychology because they didn't think I would find a job in it. So I went down a different route and eventually got back into psychology and ended up in graduate school, working on my PhD in social psychology, studying what makes relationships work. And as I was in that program, I realized that, we're talking about how to maintain healthy relationships, but nobody's talking about sex. And so that sort of led me into this world of sex and relationships at the intersection between them. And then as I left graduate school, I kind of got back to my journalistic roots because I was a scientist trained in studying sex and relationships, but I wanted to share what I was learning with the public. And so I started a blog and a podcast called Sex and Psychology. I started writing for media outlets. And basically what I want to try and do is not just conduct the research, but also put it in the hands of people who can use it to improve and enhance their own intimate life.
Well, I want to say that I have gone through your blog and your podcast, and I love the content, mainly because you actually you do cover these topics that are not, they're so practical and we all deal with them, but you're right, we're not really talking about them, and you go there. So thank you for that. But you brought up a really interesting point in that we're okay talking about relationships to a degree, but we are still, it seems, as a culture, not okay talking about our sexuality or even anything that might make us too intimately connected to one another. What is that? Why?
Yeah, so it's funny that we live in this world where sex seems like it's all around us. You see it in advertising and in television and in film. And it would seem from the outside that we're comfortable with sex, but we're not. There's still so much shame and stigma and embarrassment surrounding sex. And we don't really equip people with the tools or skills to talk about sex in healthy ways. Because, for example, in the United States, where I live, there's very little in the way of sex education that actually happens. And much of it is abstinence based, where it's just kind of like, don't do it, wait until marriage, which is not a very realistic thing to tell adolescents in an era where the average age of first marriage is about 30. And you have a lot of people who just aren't getting married at all. So you're sort of telling people just don't do it or don't do it for decades. And it's like, that's not really going to work. And I think when we look at other countries, other cultures where they talk about sex in different ways and they have different models of sex education, they really start at a young age of just sort of normalizing, how do you talk about your body? How do you discuss boundaries? They teach people the actual correct anatomical names for their body parts. And so they're giving people a language that they can use. So I think there's a lot that we can learn by looking at other parts of the world, like, for example, the Netherlands, where I think they have a great approach to sex education, and then maybe exporting some of that to places that just kind of have a lot of problems still when it comes to talking about sex. So I actually have a textbook on human sexuality called The Psychology of Human Sexuality, and we sort of trace the history of sex in that. And we talk a lot about different religious influences around the world. And, that certainly plays a big role in many cultures in terms of shaping the dominant attitudes towards sex. But there's more to it than that. Sex is this very big, very complex phenomenon. And, even in places where you don't have very strong religious identification among large segments of the population, you still have a lot of that shame and stigma and embarrassment that happens around sex, which says there's more to it than that. And it's something that's just sort of embedded in our culture. And it's really hard to break through that taboo sometimes.
I definitely agree. I like what you said as far as maybe if we got more involved in education at a younger age, as opposed to, when you're 18, it's kind of like, okay, figure it out now, you know, but we are kind of programmed to be abstinent. But as you also mentioned, that's not really realistic. So yeah, there is this guilt and shame and having to hide this part of who we are as human beings. And then we have platforms like Jasmin, which I know that you created content for, which are on the up and up big time, but still facing a lot of culturally like a stigma or backlash. Even though these platforms are booming, you're either on them or using them, you're creating on them or using them. Why is that?
I mean, I think the fact that these platforms are so popular speaks to just how powerful our interest in sex is and how much interest there is in gaining knowledge and also in connecting with other people and trying to meet some of our sexual and emotional needs. And so that's, I think, where part of the interest comes from. But on top of that is this whole layer of shame and embarrassment and stigma. And then culturally, you have a lot of just conflation of sex with being dirty and immoral. And it also gets lumped in with all these sorts of criminal and other sorts of things. And so they're not separating anything out. They're just sort of all lumping it into the same bucket, the same sex bucket, and saying that bucket is bad. We just don't want to go anywhere near there. And it's the problem because, the more that we sort of marginalize sex and make it this taboo subject, the more it makes it harder for us to communicate about this with our partners. And the more likely it is that we're going to seek out sources of information that might not be reliable. And so we might not learn accurate or helpful information about sex. So I think we have to go back and we have to normalize conversations about sex.
I love what you said there, that it's important for us now to go back and start normalizing these conversations. And again, going back to what you said earlier about education, I think that is probably the key place to target. Although it's probably not going to be an easy, it's not going to be an easy feat to get in there, Now, I know that you had done some work with Jasmin, and I'd love to talk to you about your experience and what it was like for you.
It was also interesting in my life because a lot of the work that I do is as a public speaker around sex, and all of my speaking engagements got canceled. So I was spending a lot of time at home. And so this was a way to get educational information about sex out there to a very broad and diverse audience that I might not otherwise have reached. And I actually had the time and ability to do it. And so it was a great experience, but it was also a little bit different for me because I'm used to kind of giving lectures and more of a big lecture hall kind of environment. Whereas this was sort of my first online experience where you have people asking questions live. And so it was a very different kind of thing, but I liked having that interaction. And, you kind of get to know people a little bit better. It feels in some ways surprisingly more intimate to have these conversations about sex online where you're sitting in your own home and people are asking you questions about it. And so, yeah, it was a unique experience, but one that I found to be valuable and rewarding.
That's amazing. Were there any moments that really stood out to you?
I mean, I think it was more the broader experience. And so for me, it was getting just very comfortable sitting here in my home environment, kind of revealing a little bit more about myself in some ways, right? And then also just thinking more on the fly, like with the random spontaneous questions that come up, because in the Q&A sessions, it's just kind of a free for all in terms of the types of questions people want to ask. Normally when I'm giving a lecture, it's on a very specific topic and all the questions tend to follow in a logical flow and I can often anticipate them. But, in these online environments, it's people have all these questions that they've never had answered before. And then suddenly they have an opportunity to ask the expert and then you're kind of getting it from all different angles. So it was helpful for learning how to think on the fly.
Ooh, I like that.
I think a lot of people are going, and there was actually a Kinsey Institute study about this a few years back, finding that a lot of the people who visit camming sites are really looking for emotional connection. And they're really looking to kind of just sort of meet broader intimate needs. But there's also just sexual curiosity. It's sort of learning about how different people might approach sex, or just asking questions and getting them answered in a way that you've never had answered before. Because so many of us have questions about sex and we don't have reliable sources that we can go to. I know for me growing up, we didn't really have access to the internet until I was kind of late in my teenage years. And all I had was this sort of dusty set of encyclopedias in my parents' basement. And that was not very helpful for answering my questions. And my parents weren't that open to talking about it. I didn't have any sources. And for people who are growing up now, yes, you've got the internet available to you, but you have to know the right questions to ask, and you have to phrase them in the right way. And you have to know that you're going to a source that's giving you reliable information. And so I think some of these platforms that exist can sort of help to curate that content for people to ensure that they're getting what it is that they're actually looking for, but it can also help them to kind of meet their needs for social connection at the same time. And, as I said last year when I was doing this work with Jasmin, I wasn't really able to leave my home very much. And so, having that opportunity to just connect with other people was especially valuable during that really challenging period in time.
Did you feel like during that crazy time that none of us expected, our whole lives just got flipped upside down, literally in a matter of I feel like a week, did you receive some type of emotional reward on your end being a creator?
Sure. And it's when you get that positive feedback from people that you answered this question for me that I've always had, that, now I finally know the answer to it. Or, I really appreciated hearing your insight on this because I had never thought about this issue in that particular way. And I think when you can reach people in that way, it is very meaningful and very rewarding. But then there's also just, as I was talking about, the broader social connection piece. And also during the pandemic is really when I started my podcast. And a big reason for starting it was because I just needed to talk to other people. It was a form of therapy in some ways. And I found that I actually really enjoyed having that opportunity to have these really in-depth conversations with my guests. And I was learning so much from it. And so even though the world has opened back up, I'm continuing with the podcast because it's such a valuable learning tool for me. It's a valuable educational tool for others. And then you also still get to meet that emotional need, that need for social connection at the same time.
I actually looked over a Kinsey study that was done on Live Jasmin, and it had said that non-sexual conversations actually received the most time on the platform and the biggest rewards on the platform. And I feel like from my perspective, that speaks volumes as far as the fact that it's, again, almost about this, it's like a talk therapy thing that's happening digitally. What is going on there? Why does the non-sexual conversation get more time and more rewards? What are your thoughts on that?
I mean, I think it makes total sense. And you actually see the same thing that happens in sex clubs in the real world. So, for example, if you think about strip clubs, I have interviewed some former strippers and adult performers on my podcast, and they've said the same thing, that sometimes their biggest tippers are the people who come in who, they're not there for sexual thrills. They're just there to talk to someone. And oftentimes they're just this emotional outlet for somebody who maybe just doesn't have any other sources in their life. And there can be all kinds of reasons for that, but it's often the case for people, for example, in marital relationships, where a lot of people feel like they can't have friendships outside of that marriage. And so, and if you can't confide everything in your spouse, or if you feel too uncomfortable revealing certain things to them, you need some other source where you can talk things through. And so that's where, for example, sometimes it happens in strip clubs, sometimes it happens in, cam environments, but it's fulfilling that emotional need that's just not present otherwise in their life.
This conversation I feel like it's revealing a new part of this to me, because I think there's something even deeper here that you've kind of touched on, which is that, you're absolutely right. Like, not all of us have a perfectly balanced source in our life of who to go to, who to talk to, who to express with. And so we kind of, I don't know, we seek it in other ways. Um, I know when I was in college, I worked at a sports bar for a little bit and I would bartend, and it's true, like people would come in and order and they would just lay their problems on me, you know what I mean? And I would listen happily, and they would tip very well. But I was serving them food and drinks, you know what I mean? There wasn't that agreement that we were going to have a conversation, but I guess it was almost this unspoken thing. And so what I really appreciate about platforms like Jasmin is that um, it's clear. It's clear that there's this agreement that, you can share with me, you can ask me to do things or not. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, it's making me think about how this might be becoming more common in the modern world because our expectations for our relationships have changed so much. And if you think about sort of the history of marriage and relationships, it used to be about meeting basic survival needs, putting a roof over your head and getting food and making sure that the children survive and all that kind of stuff. But now that we've taken care of our basic survival needs, we can focus more on self-actualization and getting all of those other intimate, emotional, and other needs met. And so increasingly we expect our romantic partners to be our best friends, to be our everything. And it's really hard to find that one other person who can meet every single need that you're going to have now and forever. And as we work more and we have all these extra expectations for marriage, it's a really hard thing to balance. I mean, it's really hard for one person to meet every need that you have: sexual, intimate, emotional, right? These are all things where it kind of takes a village to meet all of these needs. And the more pressure we put on one person to meet every need that we might have, the more stress and strain it can put on that relationship. And so having other friendships, having outlets through technology to help you meet some of these needs can all be very helpful ways of navigating modern relationships. But we need to change the way we think about relationships and also recognize that just having other friendships in your life, other people you can talk to, isn't a form of infidelity, right? Because a lot of people sort of conflate that and think that, if you're going to be confiding in someone, it should only be in your romantic partner. So we kind of need to get more secure in ourselves to allow us the opportunity to kind of be more flexible in terms of how we meet our needs.
Yeah, what it sounds like to me is basically, as far as our relationships go, intimacy goes, we need to evolve now because the previous stages were serving us. Like you said, before, relationships were more about survival, like let's link up and stay alive, basically. But we have evolved past that because we live in a life now in society where our everyday needs are very easily met. And so now we need to evolve more towards self-actualization, like you said. And maybe now we're at the stage where we're looking at what we've been doing and seeing how it doesn't quite work for us now and figuring out how to move forward. Actually, it was Kinsey that did a study that said that webcamming sites like Jasmin are a better place for people who are kind of having that feeling of that their partner can't meet all their needs, but it's less threatening for their partner because there's not someone actually being physically introduced to the mix.
Right. And I think that's so true that there are now all kinds of different ways that we can go about meeting our needs and finding social connection. And the more options and opportunities there are available to us, the better. But another piece of the puzzle here is that we as human beings, we live a lot longer than we ever did before. And, that poses another challenge for relationships where, it was one thing when people only lived a couple of decades, you didn't have to spend that long with any one person. But now if you're talking about, 30, 40, 50 years plus with just one individual, that's a really long time. And it becomes really difficult for that one person to meet all of your needs. In conducting research on sexual fantasies, I actually find that one of the biggest reasons that people hold back their fantasies and don't share them with a partner is that they're afraid of being judged or shamed. And so we need to find sometimes safe spaces where we can talk about these important issues to us. And there's a lot of potential outlets. I think we would do well to sort of normalize sex talk between friends, right? And not just think that sex talk only has to happen with your romantic partner, because sometimes just being able to talk about sexual issues with friends, like, hey, I'm experiencing this. Have you ever experienced that before? That can help provide some of that normalization. But for people who don't have that in their romantic relationship or in their friendships, technology provides this other outlet. And the anonymity of it can relieve you of some of the social consequences, but it does cut both ways, right? So as a social psychologist, we know that anonymity is very valuable, for example, in survey studies that we do for collecting honest responses from participants. But we also know that anonymity can sometimes lead people to do things that they wouldn't otherwise do, that can be non-consensual or problematic in other ways. And so we sort of have to balance that need. And that's why on some of these platforms, you see a mix of good and bad behavior on the part of some of the participants who come in. And so that's why you need moderation and other tools to ensure that you're providing that safe space for people to meet those needs that they have, to ask their questions, to emotionally connect, but also to kick out the people who abuse the privileges of it.
I think, if someone is on a platform like Jasmin and they are trying to explore themselves or vent, it does need to be very safe for them. And that is, I think, one of the beautiful things about Jasmin, in the sense of, yes, trolls can be kicked out immediately of the room. And my thought is, if there is someone who might have a fantasy and they talk about it with a model and she's very receptive to it, could that give him enough confidence to say, you know what, I'm going to talk about this with my partner?
Yeah, I think this can provide a very valuable source for people to sort of gain self-understanding and also build up a little bit of self-confidence at the same time. Because if you have somebody telling you that you're normal, that can be a very, very powerful thing if you've never heard that before in your life.
Confidence, that's a big one. What, from your perspective, is the number one contributing factor to confidence?
Well, I think it's a little different for different people because there are all kinds of reasons why we might not feel confident, right? So I can say for me personally, growing a beard was the best thing I ever did for my sense of self-confidence.
Oh, wow. Love it.
But growing a beard is not the solution for everyone, right? So it's about kind of figuring out what it is that works for you. And if you don't feel confident because you don't feel normal, for example, because you don't feel like what it is that turns you on or what your sexual fantasies are is something that other people have, then it's about educating yourself about maybe what a normal sexual fantasy is. A lot of people also feel that they're not normal and they lack confidence because they think that there's something wrong with their body. It turns out that a lot of sex therapy is actually just sex education, and it's giving people the statistics and the information they need to understand that normal is this wide range. It's not just one thing. Odds are you fall within that range and you don't have anything to be worried about. So I think through education, we can really help a lot in terms of building up people's self-confidence. But, again, if the source of the lack of confidence is something else, like body insecurity or something else, then the solutions might be very different. It could be exercise, changing your appearance, whatever. But the key is pinpoint the source and find a solution for sort of building that up.
It goes back to what you talked about earlier, which is self-actualization, I think, which probably includes a lot of self-exploration to find those things and figure it out. What are some tips that you might have for someone who's trying to embark on that journey?
So if you have concerns, for example, with body image, and that's something that is holding you back, something that often helps is engaging in body appreciation exercises where you're literally standing in front of a mirror naked and you look for something about your body. It might take you a little while, but you look for something that you like, that you appreciate, that is good about your body. And then you tell that to yourself. And then you go back repeatedly, day after day, and you sort of do the same thing. And eventually you're going to notice new through things and find all of these great and wonderful things about your body. And so that's something that can help a lot of people in building up that sort of sense of body self-confidence. And that can translate to benefits in the bedroom, right? Because if you feel confident in your body when you're approaching sex, that can help you to relax in the moment and not be in your head thinking about how do I look and all these other things. But also, once you sort of develop that sense of self-confidence, you just carry yourself differently in daily life. You walk through the world in a different way. You hold your head up a little higher, and people notice it, and people are attracted to confidence. So, that's one of the best things that you can do in terms of, for example, if you're navigating dating and struggling with it, is developing that sense of self-confidence, because people will see it and it will translate to how they interact with you. And once people start treating you in that different way, you start seeing yourself in that different way. And, it's just sort of this wonderful cascading domino effect that can happen.
It's really interesting because you mentioned like when people start treating you a certain way, then you start seeing it even more. And I'm wondering, the creators on platforms like Jasmin, sometimes a member might come in and say, you have a really beautiful smile. And they're like, well, I've never even thought about my smile, do I? And then maybe they start seeing it. Did you have any moments like that when you were on Jasmin, where a member pointed out something that they liked in you and you're like, whoa, you're right. Like, I do have a really great, whatever, beard.
I mean, I did get a lot of comments about the beard. And that's one of the things that people comment on about me most frequently. And, it wasn't something that I expected when I initially grew a beard, but it's through in-person interactions, whether it's like getting on a flight pre-pandemic and the flight attendant says you should be a beard model, or being in a room on Jasmin and, people sending comments and emojis about your beard. Like it happened in a lot of different ways. And all of that made me realize, hey, I guess it is a pretty good beard. And, that does affect how you see yourself. So much of self-confidence and sexual self-confidence is just about sort of getting that sense of validation from other people and allowing yourself to accept that validation. And, that's the really hard part. And, it's something that I struggled with for much of my life, was that I couldn't accept a compliment from anyone else because I didn't feel very confident and secure in myself. So I would always make, I'm a social psychologist, so I always talk in social psychology speak, but I would always make an external attribution, right? So rather than make an internal attribution and say that's representing something good about me, I would say, no, they're just like trying to get something from me, or they don't really mean it. They're just trying to be nice and they're secretly making fun of me. We tend to go down these rabbit holes when we can't open ourselves up to even accepting a compliment. And that makes it really hard to build up any kind of sense of confidence.
How did you kind of overcome that and start, like, what is that first step in allowing love in? A compliment to me, it's a form of love, right? And you're so right. Like, many of us are kind of in that state where we just can't let it in. It's even hard to even say thank you sometimes because you just don't believe it about yourself. And I'm curious, from your perspective, what's that first step in just really taking that in?
Yeah. I mean, this is making me think about how, for example, RuPaul always says, if you can't love yourself, how the hell are you going to love someone else? And it is so true that you can't let love in. It's very hard to start relationships, very hard to feel good about yourself if you just can't accept basic compliments from other people. And so, again, as a social psychologist, I have to say the answer is a little different for everybody, and it depends on what the root of the confidence issue is. For me, another area where I did not feel confident for a long time, and that was a big source of insecurity and anxiety, was the sound of my voice. I didn't like the way that it sounded. And something I didn't realize until I actually went to a vocal coach later on was like, oh, maybe some of my early trauma surrounding my voice, where people made fun of it for the way that it sounded, led me to talk in a lower register where, I just didn't want to be heard. And so for so much of my life, people were always telling me to speak up and that they couldn't hear me. And they thought that I was just a quiet person. But actually, that may have been a response to this sort of trauma that I experienced, where I just started to talk in a different way in response to the way that other people were treating me. And so it's funny that I run a podcast now and I perform with my voice. And, that's a big part of my job and what I do. And a big part of the way that I got over it was a couple of years ago, I had to record an audiobook for my book that came out. And I had to sit in a studio for 17 hours and hear myself talking over and over. So it's really a form of flooding, right? Where you can't escape the sound of your own voice. Previously, I never wanted to hear my voice. Anytime it was recorded, I was like, shut it off, don't want to hear it. But this was where I actually had to sit there and listen to it. And I'm like, it actually doesn't sound bad. And so part of developing that confidence, getting over some of those insecurities, is just confronting that thing that is really the root source of the issue, whether it's the sound of your voice, whether it's the way that you look, whether it's, something else. So it's really just finding that root source and confronting it for the first time.
I love that. I feel like I had so many light bulbs go off just now because obviously, if we have these insecurities about ourselves, there's this fear there that other people are thinking it too. And we're not lovable because of those things, right? And then what you just said is you confront it, which would be facing that fear, insecurity, whatever it is. And on the other side of that is the love. And I really love what you said. And by the way, you have a wonderful voice. It's like noticeably wonderful, really, So that is very interesting.
Well, thank you. It's funny because the things that we are often most insecure about, other people don't notice. And they're not thinking that same thing that we are. And so a big part of this is getting out of your head and realizing that, you might be wrong and you might be focusing on the wrong things. And you are holding yourself back from so much happiness and pleasure and relationships and connection. And it's really, building up that confidence, learning how to love yourself, that is really the key to just happiness in life in general.
You're so right. It really is about, I think, piece by piece, building that confidence. And I think sometimes about how social media or platforms like Jasmin, if we can almost get strategic with them, can really, really help facilitate that, in the sense of either for the model, I know for me on social media, when I drop a picture and someone comments about, I look good or whatever the case is, it is such a confidence boost. And even if I was having a bad day, it still lifts me up because it's that love, And so I'm sure, I know for sure actually that the models on Jasmin also receive confidence from these members that in some ways I think genuinely fall in love with what they're giving, and then when the model reciprocates by paying them attention, they also get their confidence boosted. And I feel like if we just get enough of these little steps or hits or whatever you want to call it, it's like it really can move us forward if we know how to strategically use it. What are your thoughts around that?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. It's a two-way street for the performer and for the visitors on sites like this. But also there is something to be said for sort of having the repeated experience with this, because, just a one-time thing probably isn't going to be enough to, boost that confidence, give you what you need to really open yourself up. But that's where, for example, if you're on, say, Jasmin, and you're having the same sort of interaction with multiple people and getting that same sort of feedback, then at some point you can't ignore it anymore. You can't discount it. You can't keep making the external attribution, and you have to accept, like, hey, there's actually something to this.
Absolutely. What role do you think that social media and platforms like Jasmin are playing in our human connection evolution in this new world?
So it's playing both good roles and bad roles. It's a mixed bag, because I think we still haven't found out how to effectively navigate all of these platforms and by virtue of moving so much of our social lives onto the internet in such a short period of time, there's bound to be some hiccups along the way. But if you look at some of the good things, one is that it gives a lot of people the opportunity to connect with others who share the same views or are part of the same community as them that they wouldn't have otherwise found in just everyday life. And sometimes you'll have interactions online with people who are across the world that you never otherwise would have had the opportunity to meet. And they can enrich your life in so many ways. And you can learn about how things might work in a different part of the world or a different culture. And so in a lot of ways, it can open up our eyes to the vast diversity that exists on this planet. And it can also give us a chance to meet emotional needs when we might otherwise have difficulty doing that in everyday life. And you can think about this on multiple levels. It could be somebody who's, say, in a relationship but doesn't really have any friends, and so they gravitate online to talk to other people. It could be somebody with a disability or a senior citizen who maybe can't leave their home or has difficulty interacting with the world around them. So it creates this new avenue and in some cases a lifeline for people to sort of emotionally connect with others. But by the same token, it's all the bad things we talked about earlier, where you can have the trolling and bullying and harassment that sometimes happens. And so we're still navigating, how do we get more of the good and less of the bad? And that's really the key direction we need to go in the future.
Absolutely. And everything you said, it's so true. I was even just reflecting on my own experiences in my life. I have one of my best friends who I still haven't met in person ever. She lives on the other side of the country. We met in an online forum and just clicked, had so much in common. And because we're not in person, we actually are constantly texting, leaving voice notes. And that is so comforting. I actually like having that digital constant connection as opposed to some of my girlfriends who I can go get a coffee with. So I think you're absolutely right. The online space, this online world it's brought so many blessings. And you're right, there are also, negative things and the dark side, but I would say in this space, I am convinced that the good far outweighs the bad.
Yes. And I'm with you. And also as a sex educator, social media provides this fantastic way to reach a much wider audience than I otherwise would, and to get responsible information out there to people who really want it and need it. So it can also be this fantastic educational tool. Again, got to balance that with some people putting not as good information out there, but on balance, yeah, I've experienced many more benefits with it personally and professionally than negatives.
Absolutely. And you're right. We were only touching mainly on the interpersonal side of it, because professionally, it's made everyone's career explode in the sense that the opportunities are absolutely endless. Like you were saying, live events shut down, but then that, because everyone was inside, that opened the door for this new type of show, which was you going live and interacting one-on-one, which, as we know, in a live space, people can't just instantly ding you immediately and ask you a question. Maybe they can raise their hand, or maybe they just have to listen. And in this new space, you're able to be more interactive. Touching on social media, and the fact that you study intimacy, sex, and fantasy specifically, I'm curious what your thoughts are. And you've also created on Jasmin. What are your thoughts as far as the differences between Jasmin and social media, and Jasmin and traditional porn?
Mm-hmm. So in terms of the contrast between Jasmin and your typical social media outlets, Jasmin is a bit more sex positive, obviously. And that's something that as a sex educator, I struggle with daily. For example, on Facebook and Instagram, if I want to talk about just any sex related issue, every day it's always a fear of, is this the day I get banned? Right? Because there are limitations and restrictions on what you can say, even if you're just providing responsible, science-based sex education, no nudity, nothing else. The fact that I still have to worry about that is kind of mind-blowing in a lot of ways. And I have a lot of friends who are sex educators on social media who basically, they have to talk in code. They can't type out the word sex, they write segs, S-E-G-G-S. And it's like, I cannot bring myself to say segs, you know? Now, Twitter is a much more open platform. It's much less restricted currently. Will it always stay that way? I don't know. But that's part of the reason I've tried to be very diversified in my social media outlets is you don't want to put all your eggs in one basket because they keep adding new restrictions and every outlet seems to become more restrictive by the day. So it's hard to be a sex educator on social media. So that's why I did appreciate, you know, being on Jasmin, because there weren't those sort of restrictions on what I could say, what I could talk about, and so forth. And then in terms of how it's different from, you know, sort of typical mainstream porn, well, you can't interact with porn in the way that you can with Jasmin. You can't ask your questions. You can't develop an emotional connection with that person in the porn video that you can on a cam site. So it's different in a lot of different ways. And in that way is sort of this unique hybrid platform that you can't really find anywhere else.
Yeah, I agree, because it's like, you can talk about anything. I think that's what people, you know, maybe the people that call Jasmin just porn, they're not understanding is, like you said, there's a connection relationship there with the creator, and they don't have to do anything that has to do with anything sexual. They don't have to. They have the freedom to choose, like you said, as far as the censorship thing. But, you know, there are girls that really have nothing to do with sex that are on the platform. So yeah, I think there's just a misunderstanding. I think maybe anything that could have a sexual nature to it, people are instantly like, nope, it's porn. That's this and that's that, and it's classified. And like you said, as a professional, an expert, you can't even be on probably the biggest, you know, social media site, which is Instagram at the moment, without being a little bit concerned about if your content is going to be removed and flagged and banned when you're not really doing anything explicit.
No, I am a sex educator. I don't get naked or take my clothes off or anything. And, there's nothing wrong with performers who want to do that. But, I'm just providing strictly science-based educational content. And every day it's just constantly running into roadblocks about how to get it out there. And that all goes back to what we talked about earlier with all of the shame, embarrassment, and stigma that just goes along with sex more generally. And when we stifle just basic conversation about sex, when we stifle sex education, I think that's bad for all of us.
Absolutely. Absolutely. We're not out of the pandemic, as you know, and life seems to be getting stranger and crazier every day. What are your suggestions on how people can stay connected during this time, or get that need of human connection met if their situation is more challenging, if they are isolated or not traveling or whatever the case is?
I know that for a lot of people, they have just in the basic everyday social interactions that maybe we took for granted before, where maybe it was just with your barista at the coffee shop or with the cashier at the grocery store. Those interactions have suddenly become a lot more meaningful and important because they're a way that we continue to connect with other people, even when we might have very limited opportunities outside of the house. And so I think in some ways that might encourage people to actually be nicer and to converse more just in those little minor situations. And so that's one way you can sort of take advantage of just everyday life to find those little opportunities to connect. Now, I know that in and of itself isn't going to be enough to meet these deep needs for connection. And that's where going online can work for a lot of people. And, something we've seen in our research at the Kinsey Institute during the pandemic is that the nature of online dating has changed. It used to be this very superficial thing where you just sort of swipe and look at photos and maybe you send a couple of short messages and then you meet pretty quickly. But now people are having much deeper, more intimate conversations online before they actually meet in person. And so part of it is just sort of changing your approach, changing your stereotypes about online dating and online interaction connection and realize that you can actually have a lot more intimacy that you can cultivate online than you ever thought possible. So if you just approach it the right way, you open up a lot more possibilities.
Well, I just want to thank you so much for your time today and just sharing your wisdom.
Yeah, it was nice to chat with you.
Yeah, you too. And seriously, keep like doing what you have to do as far as education goes, because I really do think that you nailed it as far as like that's probably our biggest step and also our biggest resistance, you know.
And it's also something that has kind of changed my career and grown my career in a lot of ways, is that a lot of sexual health and wellness brands have realized that they can't succeed if we don't educate people about sex. And so a big part of the reason I get hired by a lot of companies is to just do that basic educational work, because you need to break through the shame and the stigma and taboos in order to just even get people open to the idea of considering using your product, whether it's a lubricant or a sex toy or an app, whatever it is. So I think there's a lot more work that can be done between, the sex education community and the sexual health and wellness industry, where it's a great symbiotic relationship. It's win-win for everybody, and then also win-win for society.
Absolutely. And I know that you're a really good educator because I saw that Harvard has recognized you a few times for teaching. Is that right?
Yep, I taught there for a few years and got a few teaching awards, including for my human sexuality class.
That's incredible. Seriously, that's incredible.
People often say sex sells. Nope, sex is a much harder sell than you think it is.
Right. Yeah.